In a small, quiet town surrounded by soft hills and endless stretches of green fields, there lived a woman named Margaret Whitmore. Everyone called her Maggie, and she was known for her calm demeanor and warm smile. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. Maggie had spent most of her life as a senior judge in the district court, making tough decisions that shaped lives. But after decades of serving justice from behind the bench, she decided it was time to hang up her robes and retreat to a simpler life. Her sanctuary, a beautiful ranch passed down through her family for generations. The ranch was more than just land to Maggie, it was her heart. It sat on the edge of town, far enough to feel secluded, but close enough to still be part of the community. Rolling pastures stretched out as far as the eye could see, dotted with wildflowers in spring and golden grasses in summer. An old wooden fence marked the boundary of her property, weathered by time but sturdy enough to keep everything intact. Every morning, Maggie would sip her coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. This place gave her peace, a reward for years of hard work and sacrifice. Maggie loved tending to the ranch. She took care of the animals, mended fences when needed, and planted flowers along the driveway every year. The ranch wasn't huge or fancy, but it didn't need to be. To Maggie, it was perfect. She often thought about how lucky she was to have such a special piece of earth to call her own. Her grandparents had once walked these fields, and now she did too, carrying their legacy forward. But despite its charm, the ranch wasn't completely isolated. Over the years, new developments sprouted nearby. Cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns and shiny mailboxes. These belonged to the Homeowners Association, or HOA, which governed the neighborhood like a strict school principal. They had rules for everything: what color your front door could be, how tall your hedges were allowed to grow, even whether you could leave a garden gnome on your lawn. Maggie tried to stay out of their way. She paid her dues, kept her property tidy, and minded her own business. After all, she valued harmony over conflict. Still, living next to an HOA wasn't always easy. There were occasional complaints about noise from her roosters or concerns about stray branches hanging over the fence line. Each time, Maggie handled things politely, explaining her side and finding solutions that worked for everyone. She figured being reasonable was the key to avoiding trouble, and honestly, she had no reason to think otherwise. Life at the ranch was peaceful, predictable, and exactly how she wanted it. Little did Maggie know, however, that this fragile balance was about to shatter. One day, while checking her mailbox, she found an envelope addressed to her in bold letters. Curious, she opened it right there under the shade of an oak tree. What she read inside made her heart sink. The letter claimed that part of her cherished ranch, land she'd cared for and protected for years, didn't actually belong to her. Instead, it supposedly fell under the HOA's jurisdiction. Worse, they demanded she remove her fence immediately or face legal consequences. For a moment, Maggie stood frozen, clutching the letter tightly in her hand. How could this happen? She knew the history of her land better than anyone. The boundaries had never been questioned before. Something felt off, almost personal. As the breeze rustled through the leaves above her, Maggie realized this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. Someone had crossed a line, and she wouldn't let it slide, not without a fight. The letter from the HOA arrived like a storm cloud on an otherwise sunny day, casting a shadow over Maggie's peaceful existence. At first, she thought it might be some sort of administrative mix-up, a clerical error that could easily be resolved with a phone call or a quick visit to their office. But as she read through the document again, her initial confusion turned into disbelief. According to the HOA, a recent survey conducted by a professional firm had determined that part of her ranch land, specifically the section near the eastern fence, actually belonged to the association's communal property. They claimed her fence encroached on their territory and demanded its immediate removal. Maggie couldn't wrap her head around it. That stretch of land wasn't just any ordinary patch of dirt. It held memories. Her father had planted apple trees there when she was a child, and those same trees still bore fruit every fall. She remembered picking apples with her siblings, laughing until their sides hurt, while trying not to step on anthills. Later, as an adult, she built a small chicken coop in that area, where her hens now clucked happily each morning. To say this land didn't belong to her felt absurd. It was hers, not just legally but emotionally. Determined to get answers, Maggie decided to investigate further. She dug out old documents stored in boxes at the back of her attic. Deeds signed by her grandparents, maps drawn decades ago, and even faded photographs showing her family standing proudly beside the very fence the HOA now disputed. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth. The land had always been part of her property. The boundaries hadn't changed since her grandfather first marked them with wooden stakes all those years ago. So why were they suddenly being challenged? Despite having proof in hand, Maggie knew better than to confront the HOA impulsively. After years of presiding over courtrooms, she understood the value of diplomacy. She wrote a polite letter to the association, explaining her position and offering to share the historical records proving her ownership. Surely, once they saw the evidence, they'd realize their mistake and drop the matter. Or so she hoped. A week later, Maggie received a response, but not the one she expected. Instead of acknowledging her claims, the HOA doubled down. Their reply came in the form of a formal notice reiterating their demand and warning her that failure to comply would result in legal action. This time, the tone of the letter was colder, almost condescending. It suggested that Maggie's misunderstanding stemmed from outdated information and urged her to accept the findings of their surveyor without question. Frustration bubbled inside her, though she kept it hidden behind a calm exterior. Who did these people think they were? Did they honestly believe she'd simply back down because they waved a piece of paper in her face? Maggie knew surveys could be wrong. They weren't infallible, especially if done carelessly or with bias. And something about this whole situation smelled fishy. Why had the HOA suddenly decided to challenge her boundaries after all these years? What prompted them to commission a survey in the first place? Her suspicions deepened when she started hearing whispers around town. Apparently, the HOA had been eyeing her land for a while, hoping to expand their development plans. Some neighbors hinted that the association wanted to build more houses closer to the ranch, which would require using parts of her property. Maggie couldn't help but wonder if greed, rather than accuracy, was driving their actions. Was this really about boundaries, or was it about money? As days passed, Maggie found herself pacing the length of her porch, staring at the contested fence line. Every glance at the apple trees and the chicken coop filled her with determination. She wouldn't let anyone take what rightfully belonged to her, not without a fight. Though she preferred a quiet life away from drama, she also knew when to stand her ground. If the HOA thought they could push her around, they were sorely mistaken. Little did they know, they were dealing with someone who had spent years ensuring fairness in far more complicated situations than this. Maggie knew she couldn't let the HOA's demands go unanswered, but she also didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. After all, she had spent years in courtrooms teaching others the value of patience, reason, and fairness. If there was any chance to resolve this peacefully, she was determined to try. So with her stack of old deeds, maps, and photographs in hand, Maggie decided to attend the next HOA meeting. She hoped that by presenting her case directly to the board members, she could clear up the misunderstanding before it spiraled further out of control. The meeting took place in a small community center just down the road from her ranch. Rows of folding chairs were set up for residents, and at the front sat a long table where the HOA board members gathered. Maggie arrived early, dressed simply but neatly, carrying a folder filled with her evidence. As she entered the room, a few neighbors nodded politely, though most avoided making eye contact. Word had spread about the dispute, and no one seemed eager to get involved. When it was her turn to speak, Maggie stood confidently and introduced herself. "Good evening," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Margaret Whitmore, and I live on the ranch adjacent to your development. I'm here today because I received a letter claiming part of my land belongs to the HOA. I'd like to show you documents proving otherwise." She laid out her case step by step, starting with the original deed signed by her grandparents decades ago. The faded ink and yellowed paper told a story of ownership stretching back nearly a century. Next, she showed them old maps marked with clear boundary lines, lines that matched perfectly with the current fence surrounding her property. Finally, she shared photographs taken over the years, her father planting apple trees, her own hands building the chicken coop, and countless moments spent tending to the land. Each piece of evidence reinforced the same conclusion. This land had always been hers. As Maggie spoke, she noticed varying reactions among the board members. Some looked genuinely interested, leaning forward to examine the documents more closely. Others appeared uncomfortable, shifting in their seats or avoiding her gaze altogether. But when she finished, hoping for a thoughtful discussion, the response wasn't what she expected. One board member, a man named Carl who often dominated these meetings, cleared his throat loudly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said dismissively, "while we appreciate your enthusiasm, surveys don't lie. We hired professionals to assess the boundaries, and their findings are final." His tone carried an undertone of superiority, as if her arguments held little weight compared to the authority of the surveyor. Another member chimed in, adding fuel to the fire. "Besides," she said with a shrug, "these old papers might have sentimental value, but they don't hold up against modern technology. Times change, Mrs. Whitmore, and so do property laws." The room fell silent after that, save for a few murmurs from other attendees. Maggie felt a flicker of anger rising within her, but quickly pushed it aside. She reminded herself to stay composed, even as their words stung. They weren't just dismissing her evidence, they were dismissing her asterisk. It was almost as if they assumed she wouldn't, or couldn't, fight back because of her age. After the meeting ended, Maggie lingered for a moment, watching as the board members packed up their things. She overheard snippets of their conversation as they joked about how admirable she'd been, presenting her little folder like some kind of school project. One even remarked, "She probably doesn't even know what a real courtroom looks like anymore." Their laughter echoed in the emptying room, leaving Maggie standing alone amidst the folding chairs. Walking back to her car under the dim streetlights, Maggie replayed the scene in her mind. She hadn't expected them to roll out a red carpet for her, but their arrogance caught her off guard. Did they really think she was just another elderly homeowner too timid to stand up for herself? If so, they were in for a rude awakening. Maggie had spent years ensuring justice prevailed in far more complex cases than this, and while she preferred diplomacy, she also knew when enough was enough. Back home, as she poured herself a cup of tea and stared out at the darkened fields, Maggie allowed herself a small smile. The HOA had underestimated her, and that was their first mistake. The HOA's dismissive attitude at the meeting left Maggie with no choice but to take matters into her own hands. She had tried diplomacy, presenting her case with evidence and patience, only to be met with condescension and mockery. It was clear now that they weren't interested in fairness or truth. They were determined to push their agenda, regardless of the facts. But Maggie wasn't about to back down. After decades of ensuring justice in courtrooms, she knew exactly how to handle people who underestimated her. Sitting at her kitchen table the next morning, Maggie carefully drafted a letter addressed to the HOA board. Her tone remained polite, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. "Dear members of the Homeowners Association," she began, choosing her words deliberately. She explained once again why the disputed land belonged to her, referencing the historical documents she'd already shared. Then came the part she knew would grab their attention. "As a retired senior judge of the district court, I must remind you that false claims against property ownership can have serious legal repercussions. Additionally, your continued harassment may constitute defamation of title, for which I reserve the right to seek damages." She signed the letter simply as Margaret Whitmore, retired senior judge, district court. The title alone was enough to send a message. Maggie wasn't just another homeowner. She was someone who understood the law inside and out, and she wasn't afraid to use it if necessary. With a satisfied nod, She sealed the envelope and dropped it off at the post office later that day. It didn't take long for the letter to make waves. When the HOA president opened it during their weekly meeting, the room fell eerily silent. The board members exchanged nervous glances, some whispering urgently while others stared at the paper like it might bite them. One member muttered, "Wait, this Margaret Whitmore." The judge. Another scrambled to pull up her name on their phone, quickly realizing who they were dealing with. News of her reputation spread fast. Even outside the courtroom, Maggie was known for being sharp, fair, and unrelenting when challenged. Panic set in almost immediately. The HOA's attorney was called into an emergency session, where he reviewed the situation and confirmed their worst fears. Challenging someone like Maggie in court would be foolish. Not only did she have decades of legal experience under her belt, but she also had irrefutable evidence supporting her claim. Worse still, pursuing this dispute further could expose the HOA to counterclaims of negligence and misconduct. As the lawyer bluntly put it, "You picked the wrong person to mess with." Desperate to undo the damage, the HOA attempted to backtrack. They sent a hasty follow-up letter to Maggie, claiming the entire issue was merely a misunderstanding. According to them, the surveyor they hired must have made an error, and they assured her they never intended to cause trouble. Their tone was apologetic, even groveling, as if trying to smooth things over before she decided to escalate further. But Maggie saw through their sudden change of heart. This wasn't remorse, it was fear. She read their letter with a raised eyebrow, noting how quickly they shifted from arrogance to desperation. Still, she appreciated the irony of the situation. Just days earlier, they had dismissed her as harmless, assuming she wouldn't, or couldn't, fight back. Now, they were practically begging for leniency. Rather than respond right away, Maggie took her time to consider her options. She knew forgiveness wasn't enough. Not this time. The HOA's actions went beyond a simple mistake. They had shown blatant disregard for her rights and treated her with disrespect. If she let them off too easily, they might walk away thinking they could get away with similar behavior in the future. No, this needed to be more than just a lesson for them. It needed to be a reckoning. That evening, sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, Maggie allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She thought about how far she'd come since receiving that first threatening letter. What started as frustration had turned into resolve. And now, thanks to her calm yet calculated response, the tables had completely flipped. The HOA had underestimated her once, but they wouldn't do so again. And deep down, Maggie knew this was only the beginning. Maggie wasn't the type to celebrate a temporary victory. While the HOA's groveling apology letter might have signaled their retreat, she knew it wasn't enough. Their attempt to shift blame onto the surveyor and frame the issue as a simple misunderstanding felt hollow, a desperate ploy to avoid accountability. Maggie had spent years in courtrooms where people tried to dodge responsibility for their actions, and she recognized the tactic immediately. This wasn't just about her property anymore. It was about standing up against arrogance and ensuring justice was served for herself and others who might find themselves in similar situations. After careful thought, Maggie decided to take legal action. She filed a countersuit against both the HOA and the surveying company, accusing them of trespassing, slander of title, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Her decision sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors whispered about the lawsuit over coffee at the local cafe or during evening walks with their dogs. Some admired Maggie's courage, seeing her as a symbol of resistance against the HOA's overreach. Others worried about what this meant for property values or whether taking sides could create tension in the neighborhood. Despite the mixed reactions, one thing was certain: everyone was talking about it. The HOA scrambled to contain the fallout. They held an emergency meeting behind closed doors, inviting their attorney to strategize a defense. But no matter how many angles they explored, the situation looked bleak. The evidence Maggie presented was rock solid. Historical records, photographs, and even testimonies from longtime residents who confirmed her family's ownership of the land. On top of that, The surveyor's report contained glaring inconsistencies, suggesting either incompetence or deliberate bias. Even worse, the HOA's initial refusal to listen to Maggie made them look unreasonable and heavy-handed. Public opinion was turning against them, and they knew it. As the case gained traction, local media outlets picked up the story. Reporters wrote articles highlighting the clash between the retired judge and the homeowners association, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle. One headline read, * Senior Judge Takes on HOA Bullies, a Fight for Justice on the Ranch. * The coverage brought even more attention to the dispute, drawing support for Maggie from unexpected corners. People from neighboring towns reached out, sharing their own frustrations with HOAs and praising her for standing her ground. For Maggie, though, the spotlight wasn't the goal. It was simply a byproduct of doing what was right. When the trial finally began, Maggie walked into the courtroom with quiet confidence. She chose to represent herself, knowing her experience as a judge gave her an edge. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer and tailored slacks, she carried her files neatly organized, ready to present her case. As she took her seat, she couldn't help but notice the nervous glances exchanged between the HOA's representatives. They were clearly out of their depth facing someone who understood the intricacies of the law better than their own attorney did. During the proceedings, Maggie dismantled the HOA's arguments one by one. She pointed out flaws in the surveyor's methodology, showing how key measurements contradicted older maps and deeds. She highlighted emails and letters proving the HOA had ignored her attempts to resolve the matter amicably before escalating it unnecessarily. Most damningly, she exposed internal communications revealing the HOA's interest in expanding their development, a motive that cast doubt on their claim of innocent error. Her closing statement was powerful yet measured. "This case isn't just about my land," she said, addressing the jury. "It's about fairness, respect, and holding those in power accountable when they abuse it. If we allow organizations like the HOA to trample over individuals without consequence, then none of us are safe from similar treatment." By the time she finished speaking, there was a palpable sense of admiration in the room. Even the opposing counsel seemed impressed, albeit reluctantly. When the jury returned with a unanimous verdict in Maggie's favor, the courtroom erupted in applause. The HOA was ordered to pay substantial damages, publicly apologize, and revise its policies to prevent future disputes. For Maggie, the win wasn't about money or revenge. It was about setting a precedent and reminding everyone that no one is above the law. As she left the courthouse that day, reporters called out questions, cameras flashed, and neighbors offered congratulatory hugs. But Maggie remained focused. This fight had taught her something important. Standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. With the trial over and justice served, Maggie returned to her ranch, eager to leave the chaos behind. The victory had been sweet, but it hadn't come without cost. The stress of battling the HOA had weighed on her, disrupting the peaceful rhythm of her days. Now, as she stepped back onto her porch and looked out at the fields bathed in golden sunlight, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was home, her sanctuary, and no one would ever threaten it again. The HOA's public apology arrived a week later, printed in the local newspaper under the headline *HOA acknowledges error, commits to reform*. It was formal and somewhat stiff, but it admitted fault and promised changes to prevent similar disputes in the future. Maggie read it once, folded the paper neatly, and set it aside. She didn't need their words to validate what she already knew. She had fought for her rights and won. What mattered more was how the community responded. Word of Maggie's triumph spread far beyond the small town, inspiring others to take a stand against unfair practices by their own HOAs. Neighbors who had once hesitated to speak up began organizing meetings to discuss reforms within the association. Some suggested creating committees that included non-HOA members to ensure transparency and fairness. Others pushed for stricter oversight of surveyors and contractors hired by the HOA. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood started shifting toward accountability, a change Maggie hoped would last long after the dust settled. Despite her newfound status as a local hero, Maggie preferred staying out of the limelight. She declined interviews with larger news outlets and politely turned down invitations to speak at community events. "I didn't do this for attention," she told a neighbor who stopped by with a bouquet of flowers. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Still, she couldn't escape the admiration of those around her. Every trip into town brought smiles and waves from people she barely knew, all thanking her for standing up to the HOA. Children running lemonade stands offered her free cups, and even the cashier at the grocery store slipped a note into her bag that read, "You're our hero." But Maggie's impact extended beyond her immediate community. Her story resonated with homeowners nationwide, sparking conversations about property rights and HOA abuses. Online forums buzzed with discussions about her case, with many calling her an inspiration. One woman wrote to Maggie directly, sharing how she'd been embroiled in a similar boundary dispute, but lacked the courage to fight back. "Your bravery gave me hope," the letter said. "Thank you for showing us that we don't have to accept injustice quietly." As weeks turned into months, life on the ranch slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such a whirlwind. Maggie spent her mornings tending to her animals and her afternoons pruning the apple trees her father had planted years ago. She took long walks along the fence line, now fully restored and reinforced, feeling a renewed sense of pride in the land she had defended. At night, she sat on her porch, watching fireflies dance in the cool breeze, grateful for the peace she had reclaimed. Yet, amidst the quiet, Maggie often reflected on the lessons learned during this ordeal. She realized that power, when unchecked, could easily become oppressive, even in seemingly harmless places like a suburban HOA. It reminded her why she had devoted her career to the law, to protect ordinary people from those who sought to exploit them. And while she had retired from the courtroom, this experience proved that justice wasn't confined to judges' robes or legal briefs. Sometimes, it lived in the hearts of individuals brave enough to say, "Enough is enough." Maggie also thought about legacy, not just her family's legacy tied to the ranch, but the broader legacy of standing up for what's right. She hoped her actions would inspire others to face challenges head-on, whether big or small. Courage, she believed, wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite it. And if her story encouraged even one person to advocate for themselves, then every sleepless night and moment of frustration had been worth it. One crisp autumn morning, as Maggie harvested apples from the trees near the contested fence line, she paused to glance at the horizon. The sun rose steadily, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. For the first time in months, she felt truly at ease. The battle was over, and she had emerged stronger, not just as a homeowner, but as a symbol of resilience. Whatever the future held, she knew she was ready. After all, the same determination that protected her ranch would always guide her forward. Months after the trial, Maggie's life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. The ranch was thriving, her animals were healthy, and the apple trees had produced their best harvest in years. But something else had changed, something deeper. Maggie carried herself with a quiet confidence now, a sense that she had not only defended what mattered most, but also inspired others to do the same. Her victory wasn't just personal, it had sparked a ripple effect throughout the community. The HOA, humbled by the lawsuit and its aftermath, made good on its promise to reform. They established a transparent appeals process for property disputes, hired independent auditors to review future surveys, and even created a committee that included non-HOA members to ensure fairness. While some neighbors remained skeptical of whether these changes would stick, others noticed a shift in tone. Meetings became less confrontational, decisions more collaborative. It was clear that Maggie's fight had planted seeds of accountability where there had once been arrogance. For Maggie, though, the real reward came in smaller, quieter moments. One afternoon, as she worked in her garden, a young couple approached her fence. They lived 2 streets over and had recently moved to the area. "We don't mean to bother you," the woman began hesitantly, "but we heard about what you did. We're having some issues with the HOA too, and, well, we were wondering if you'd mind giving us advice." Maggie smiled warmly and invited them in, offering lemonade and listening patiently as they explained their concerns. By the time they left, they seemed more hopeful and better equipped to handle the situation. These small acts of guidance became part of Maggie's routine, a way to pay forward the strength she'd gained through her own struggle. As word of her willingness to help spread, Maggie found herself unofficially mentoring others in the community. She didn't see herself as a leader or activist, but her calm demeanor and wealth of experience made her a trusted voice. People sought her out not just for legal advice, but for encouragement when facing challenges of all kinds. Whether it was helping a neighbor draft a polite yet firm letter to the HOA, or simply lending an ear to someone feeling overwhelmed, Maggie embraced her role with grace and humility. Her influence reached beyond her immediate circle, too. Local schools invited her to speak at career days, hoping her story would inspire students to pursue paths rooted in fairness and integrity. Though she initially declined, Maggie eventually agreed, realizing how much her journey could resonate with younger generations. Standing before a classroom of wide-eyed teenagers, she shared her experiences, not just as a judge, but as someone who had faced adversity and stood her ground. "Life isn't always fair," she told them, "but standing up for what's right makes it a little better, for yourself and for everyone around you." Evenings on the ranch were still her favorite time. With the sun setting low over the fields, Maggie often reflected on how far she'd come since receiving that first threatening letter from the HOA. Back then, she'd been angry and frustrated, unsure of how to navigate the conflict without losing her peace of mind. Now she felt empowered, knowing she'd turned a challenge into an opportunity to make a difference. The land beneath her feet wasn't just soil, it was a testament to resilience, legacy, and the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the stars appear one by one, Maggie thought about the future. She knew the world wouldn't stop throwing obstacles her way, or anyone else's, but she also knew she had the tools to face them: wisdom, courage, and an unwavering belief in doing what was right. As long as she stayed true to those principles, she believed she could weather whatever storms came next. And so, life went on. Maggie continued tending to her ranch, nurturing her relationships with neighbors, and quietly championing justice whenever she saw the need. Her story became a legend of sorts in the small town, a reminder that even in retirement, one person's determination could leave a lasting mark. For Maggie, that was enough. After all, the greatest victories weren't measured in headlines or applause, but in the lives touched and the lessons passed down. And as she gazed out at her beloved fields under a canopy of stars, she knew her legacy was secure, not just in the land she cherished, but in the hearts of those she had inspired.